Hello everybody and welcome to another video here on the channel about my book. To be really clear, this is not a story that is taking place within the book, it's just taking place within this world. So it's canon in that sense, but this is not like chapter 1. I just want to get that out of the way. On and off on my Patreon, I've been doing short stories to get critical feedback from my patrons, and that's really been wonderful. I've gotten amazing feedback, so much I haven't even been able to respond to everybody who went through and has critiqued my work. So if you took the time to do that and I've not responded, thank you, I appreciate it. But what I want to do here is take my earliest piece that I ever put out to Patreon and kind of just put it out, because also Merphy Napier, the wonderful booktuber, did an audio recording of it for me, and it was an absolute joy to have her do that, and I think she did a stellar job. So I'd also just like to share that with you all, because it's a quite entertaining interpretation of what I wrote. I will go ahead and say the prose here are clunkier than I'm currently writing, because this was obviously one of the first short stories I ever wrote, period. So I've definitely refined some of the more choppy parts you're going to get a taste of here. And on top of that, there are world building elements that are not in place yet, because this was written and recorded months ago. So you'll notice that grips, which we recently talked about in my Groholand video, link to that here if you have not seen already, are just referred to as wizards, which was just kind of my placeholder word until I had them better fleshed out, as well as one certain physical trait of grips not being applied to a character in here that should be. But aside from that, this really is a short story that is canonically taking place in this world, and if I'll go back and rewrite it at some point, I maybe will bug and pay Merphy to re-record it with the properly fixed tweaks. But please go ahead and enjoy Plant 32, the story of a plant manager who is putting out steel and iron for the Empire, who receives a mysterious convoy with some life-changing news. One quick side note before we jump into it. I've had some people be clearly confused on what setting I'm placing this world in, as it's hard to completely build an epic fantasy setting in a very short story. This is roughly comparable to like 1850s to 1880s American development, kind of in that industrial time. But I'm also blending in a lot of heftier themes of the Age of Exploration and things along those lines for the main story. So that doesn't really apply to the shorter one, but just to add a little bit of context, this is supposed to be around, I guess, comparable to 1850s, 1880s, but of course, creative liberties are being taken. Now on to Plant 32.
For the last time, girl, give me the slip or I'll take your fingers, Rami said with mirth. The only reaction his hollow threat received was a screaming giggle from the tiny girl that had invaded his office and a burst of speed. The child sprinted toward the door, leading out from his office, onto the catwalk overlooking the floor of the steel mill, a place no child would be safe, let alone a child blindly sprinting. Rami feigned a desperate grab for the paper in the trickster's hands, causing the child to focus on lifting the paper out of reach and not dodging him altogether. With a simple twist of momentum, Rami grabbed the stick-like wrist of the lost one and lifted her into the air with such force her black, curly hair bounced a couple extra times before settling. The raw glee that had previously dominated her grease-smeared face died. Fear and tinges of panic replaced them, and Rami was struck with a pang of guilt. He knew children enjoyed playing with him due to his bushy black and gray beard and immense size. Rami even had a striking resemblance to the description of a folk-tale character often used to cheer up children in the gloomy winters. Couple that with what most people called jovial demeanor, and most young ones under 10 tried to climb him like a human mountain. A small child growing up on the street, though, was probably only used to being grabbed out of aggression, or possibly as a preamble for punishment. Rami had ruined the game.
I'm sorry, little devil. I didn't mean to scare you. I just don't think it's safe for you to go sprinting out into the catwalk above vats of molten metal,
Romney said, easing the child to the ground. Her breath was fast and shallow, and Rami suspected that was more from fear than the running. It would ruin the day if he did not make the child laugh again before his shift was over. He racked his brain trying to think of something to amuse the child. Instead, what struck Rami was the fact that his office had been locked before he walked in. Yet, when he entered, This child was sitting on his desk, holding the scrap of paper now clenched tightly in her small, dirt-covered hands. The plant had decent security, but those damn orphans were everywhere. "How did you manage to get in my office anyway?" he asked, with what he hoped was a friendly grin. It seemed the grin was closer to a wolf's. As soon as he let go of her tiny arm, the girl darted for his office door and left the slip of paper floating to the ground. "Good job, Rami. You scared the girl," he thought, walking to pick up the report from one of the plant's main foremen. It would be useless for him to chase her now that she was out of his office. One of the many workers would intercept her before she got close to any dangerous areas, he was sure. It would be impossible to catch her regardless. His permanent limp made sure of that. The lost ones were becoming a very real problem. Keeping them all out of the plant was nigh impossible. Even if he set 4 or 5 of his workers the sole duty of keeping them out, the slippery little bastards always found ways in. The children loved to distract his workers. Getting attention from adults, even bothered as his people might be, was the closest thing many of them had to parenting. "There has to be something we can do here to keep them busy, safe, and supervised." Rami sat in his desk chair, read the report, and opened the desk drawer containing the candies the girl had obviously been hunting for. "Not today," he thought, scanning the document. The plant was where most of the remaining able-bodied people in nearby towns spent 12 to 14 hours a day. Only the elderly and crippled were left to watch hordes of children who ended up sneaking out and either following what remained of their families here to work or had no family left and simply wanted to be around active people. The report in his hand detailed the steel output for the previous day. From the mouths of the 60 giant egg-like converters here, 205 pounds of steel had been produced. Above the plant's average, but not remarkable. Far more wrought iron and pig iron had been produced. But iron was not what Imperial officials had been breathing down his neck about. Steel was what won wars now. The miracle metal had made guns, cannons, ship plating, really all mechanisms of war. A note had been scrawled on the bottom, reminding Rami of the visit from the Imperial offices today. Inspections happened often, and it seemed at random the plant was either given honors or reprimanded for its output. The High Royals knew how the production was limited. Chemists had spent years developing the current steel-making process. While the resulting steel was brittle, it was the most efficient output method ever seen. Unless Plant 32 was given more converters and workers, nothing more could be done. He placed the slip back on his desk and leaned back in his chair, looking out of his office's one window. The sun was near its zenith. The mist-covered barren hills of the countryside seemed to glow on the warm summer rays. What had once been the forest of his childhood was now a resource farm for the war effort. He missed those hills having trees. To win wars, all must sacrifice. The mantra of the war effort came to his lips, almost on pure instinct. Rami never questioned Imperial will. Such thoughts were treason without question. Yet, he did not envy the children of this generation, really any generation younger than his 67 years. He had just left childhood when the one above arrived in the capital city from the sky. Before his arrival, the greatest weapon man had conceived was a musket, a clunky, horrible weapon that required minutes to even reload. Even the metals back then had been crude at best. The process for removing impurities pathetic. Now, rifles loaded with cartridges, metal-plated shaped ships, and cannons with accuracy at great range dominated the battlefield. All gifts from the one above. In the time between the one above's descent into the land and now, Imperial will had been almost entirely realized. What had previously been the semi-dominant trade nation was now the Empire. The entire continent was nearly under Imperial protection. Only the kingdom of Itha to the northeast remained resistant. Held up in castles with their mountains that touched the sky, only their natural landscape kept them free. The kingdom's resistance did not matter. Just like every one of the other 11 kingdoms before it, Itha would be brought under the shade of the Imperial with blood and steel. Every pound of steel produced at this plant would be converted into weapons used to bring peace. Once those who resisted Imperial will were defeated, the unjust king of Itha would be executed. The people of Itha would be free to live under the Imperial rule, and all the resources currently being driven into the war effort would go into raising the population's quality of life.
Only, if only.
The door to Rami's office opened, admitting Jom, a foreman in charge of one of the many crews operating today. A good man to his core, Jom had worked for Rami for several years now. He was tall and fairly handsome. Even under the layers of grime that coated his face, the square chin and pale blue eyes would make many swoon for him. Unfortunately, once he opened his mouth and the harsh Shiren accent of the South assaulted whoever was listening, much of the attraction would die.
Everything well?
Rami asked. His booming voice seemed to never come out as softly as he would like. Luckily, Jom's time at this plant meant that he probably expected nothing less. Yeah, he chirped in that irritating accent. Jom stayed near the doorway, clearly eager to get back to watching over his men. The Imperial delegation is in town. Probably be here in an hour. That was not accurate. If the Imperial delegation moved from the town to the plant at the same lumbering pace as tired industrial workers in the morning, they would have been here in an hour. But accounting for the time it would take for the word to have gotten here from town to his office, the delegation was likely on his plant's doorstep. No greeting prepared. He had not even washed his face and hands. His skin was dark, but not dark enough to hide the stains of working a day here.
Rami stood. Get Shira and meet me at the gate. Do your best to look presentable, and please keep your mouth shut while the delegation is here.
Jom smiled at the comment. Yes, sir. He was out the door before the last word had fully left his mouth. Jom certainly was not self-conscious about the way he talked. No one from Shiren was. They were a proud people who had fought hard in their war. Now, all Shirens were loyal subjects. Those who fought the hardest had even been forgiven for their resistance. In fact, many now fought in the north to bring down Itha. Rami stepped over to the sink he had a crew installed in the corner. The plant was lucky enough to have running water, another one of the one above's gifts that was rapidly becoming more common. Installing a sink within his own office had been a major request, but after decades of service and asking for very little, it had been approved. Rami also suspected the Imperials liked the idea of management having their own source of running water in their offices. After all, if a plant manager could have a sink running in his office, then certainly a regent should as well.
Imperior, bless your bureaucracy,
Rami thought as he splashed cool water over his face and hands. The water spilling down the drain was black with soot. Rami did not have time to make sure everything in the plant was in order one last time before the delegation arrived, but as he walked from his office to the main gate, he surveyed his men. Everything he saw made him swell with pride. Cranes moved vats of molten metal from furnaces to converters, the orange glow coloring everything. Men and women walked between the massive pieces of equipment diligently doing their work. There certainly was chaos to any plant, but order seemed to emerge if you watched long enough. You just had to know what to look for. From his vantage point on the catwalk, everything seemed to be running without a hitch. Directly beneath him, a converter began to have hot air pumped into it, causing a reaction that would result in some of the pig iron within to turn into the precious steel. Briefly, blue light erupted from the furnace as impurities burnt off. Many other plants just like this one were in the nearby country, several operating even more furnaces and converters than were within the limiting walls here. But Rami took pride in the fact that no other plant was as efficient in utilizing the resources provided by the Empire as his own. Other plants of similar size put out pounds less steel a day. Plant 32 brought pride to the Empire. Rami passed over the last of the converters and walked down a narrow spiral staircase into a break room. The 3 men on break gave respectful nods and resumed their food and conversation. Rami had never demanded more of them, and he never would. Only those in Imperial uniforms asked for more than a respectful nod, after all. After passing through several more rooms, Rami reached an exit into the plant courtyard. The gravel underfoot ground loudly as he walked toward the front gate, roughly 100 yards down a similarly graveled road. Outside the plant, if it wasn't barren dirt, it was likely gravel. He passed the plant's smithy, a small secondary mess hall, and the medical facility. Since the new safety standards had been passed down, the accident rate had plummeted. Hard hats, insulated gloves, and eye protection were gifts from a god. Of course, things still went wrong. Last month, one of the newer night shift boys had fallen from a catwalk into one of the massive vats of molten metal. No one was sure if he had been drunk or simply careless. The report stated there had been one small yell as he fell, then only a splash of fire. When Rami arrived at the looming black metal gate, the 2 guards on duty turned to him and nodded, their gray uniforms with orange highlights signifying a role as guards of an industrial complex. Of course, there had never been an attack here. The war with Itha was nearly 1,000 miles away, and no rebels had been in this area for the better half of a decade. Still, the soldiers stationed around the small towns and by the industrial complexes, such as this one, did their jobs well. They protected locals from any outlaws, stopped children from forming any gangs, and listened to town elders about problems they saw forming within the town. They were the law and order provided by the Empire. "How's the day treating you, Rami?" the soldier on the left of the gate asked. Rami recognized the man, but couldn't recall a name. "About as well as can be expected. Still can't stop hearing the damn ringing." For weeks now, a ringing had been haunting Rami, a piercing noise that might drive him mad one day. It prevented him from sleeping most nights. He had told the soldiers about it on the 3rd day of the non-stop noise, and a dispatch had been sent to the capital. The ringing was a known medical condition, common among those working in factories. Any cases were to be reported for possible later examinations. A result in one of the first decrees handed down in the early days of the One Above's rule, an institution entirely devoted to researching and curing illnesses of all kinds. In only a few years of hard work, death from disease had dropped to a fraction of what it once had been. The One Above had passed on the knowledge of how tiny organisms the human eye could not see was responsible for all illnesses. Something that seemed like an impossibility or a joke, but who would question word from the one above all others? Besides, the law of sanitation had resulted in a decrease of illnesses. The proof was that simple. Again, God had solved a world problem with one decree. The Institute of Health was one of many creations in the last few decades that had revolutionized aspects of society. Yet, for some unknowable reason to Rami, people still resisted. Life was better in the Empire. Few starved, crime was low, and technology was improving at a pace that seemed to violate history itself. The only drawback was the amount sent to war. Thousands died every day to spread imperial will, but it was a sacrifice well worth it. What was the blood of a few generations versus a utopia for all to come? It was a price worth paying over 10-fold, 100-fold if needed be. "You should be getting a response back from the capital soon, Ram. I promise you that," the soldier on the left said. The soldier on the right nodded in affirmation. He had one more stripe on his arm, declaring a slightly higher rank. "Why can't I ever keep all the ranks straight in my head? Is 3 or 4 a sergeant?" Rami thought, pulling a smoke from his jacket pocket and lighting it with a modified flintlock. Rami turned to the guard on the right and offered his hand. "I don't believe we've met." "Jimson," the man replied, shaking his hand firmly. The soldier's hand felt soft when compared to his own. Not to say there were not calluses, but not the same as someone working in the plant. Even someone in management.
"Nice to meet you,"
Rami replied, taking a drag from his smoke. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Jom and Shira. Rami turned and nodded to them in greeting. Jom's nerves were clearly on edge now that he was actually awaiting the inspectors to arrive. This was the first time Rami had asked for his assistance in this. Jom's hands were shaking slightly at his sides, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool day. He had taken the time to swipe his face, but Rami doubted the towel had even been more than damp, and certainly not clean. The soot on his face was simply smeared around in swirls instead of streaks. Shira walked next to him, and as always was exuding youth and glee. She was the master smith of the plant, and was known in the region as the savant of her craft. Rami was sure she had spent the entire walk from the plant ribbing Jom of his obvious nervousness. The entire empire could catch fire, and all Shira would have to say was a crude joke. She was one of the few people who actually seemed to enjoy her work at Plant 32. Rami opened his mouth to ask about the state of the smithy when a sentry bell from the towers began sounding.
"It seems your envoy is here,"
Jimson stated as he unslung his rifle and checked to see if a cartridge was loaded. It did not matter who was expected. The guards prepared for a fight if someone approached the plant. Soon after, 12 guards escorting a carriage came into sight over the nearest hill. The white uniforms of guards assigned to look after royals nearly glowed in the sun. Rifles on shoulders and steps in perfect unison, they seemed more of a decoration than a fighting force. It would be a serious mistake to think them not a threat. To become assigned to the Royal Guard, a soldier had to go through the Empire's most rigorous training. Over half that tried failed, and more than a few died in the process. When they finally reached the gate, Rami threw his smoke on the gravel road and ground out the butt with his black workman's boots. There was nothing he could do for the smell, but he was used to the stench of the plant. It was likely those in the envoy would not smell the smoke over the stench of metal being worked, even if he blew a cloud directly in their faces. A crime that would have been worth lashings if he was stupid enough to actually do it. 3 figures emerged from the carriage, 2 men and a woman. One man was clearly a high officer, with enough shiny metal decorating his arm to give away his position in the blackest of night. His dark, clean-cut hair spoke of time away from war and behind a desk. The second man was one of the Academy's wizards. His night blue student's coat and black trousers screamed academia. While taking the 2 steps required down the carriage, he somehow managed to need to push his spectacles up his nose 3 times. The way his coat tails seemed to be tangled in his legs certainly did not help the matter. As soon as the woman came within sight, the atmosphere changed. The guards went from being at attention to stiff as stone statues. Jom forgot himself to whisper, "Fuck me," under his breath. And Shira took 2 steps back, a flat-out scream from any other woman. She was one of the blessed. Black combat gear covered her from head to toe. The blessed uniforms were art. Black swirls in the design of the cloth were complemented by matte black armored pads on the shoulders and chest. It was all designed to conform to the body and be lightweight. Her body moved with a grace that spoke of either dance or death. 2 pistols shone on the right side of her belt, their grips facing away from each other to be grabbed by either hand. The uniform was completed by a sword on the blessed left hip. The sword of that make was almost as infamous as the blessed themselves. The naturally pure white metal only came from one source in the whole empire, God himself. No one knows how it was made, but 7 of the 50 blessed had been deemed worthy of weapons made of the white material. The metal never dulled, cutting through nearly anything it came in contact with. The blade on the sword could be submerged into the hottest forges in existence, and the handle would remain cool. Many claimed they were simply unbreakable. Rami dropped to one knee, completely unsure of how to react to being in the presence of one of the chosen. As soon as his knee hit the gravel, the pain lanced up his bad knee. He realized this was not the appropriate response. He was debating if it would be even worse to stand his rather large body back up or remain in the awkward position. He was still debating this as the sound of footsteps on gravel brought the delegation inside Plant 32's grounds.
"Are you having trouble with your laces?"
a male voice said. Rami looked up to see the officer looking down at him. Rami pushed himself back up with a grunt. He was not sure if the officer was giving him an out or mocking. Either way, he was happy to take it.
Yes,"
Rami mumbled. All confidence had left his voice.
"This is not a typical inspection, I assume?"
A grin spread across the officer's face.
"No, and you must be Rami. I've heard very good things."
He extended his hand, and Rami took it. Rami could not help but glance over at the Blessed repeatedly during this small exchange. She stood relaxed among the guards, who were all clearly trying not to look at ease in her presence.
"I'm Sergeant Major Clev, and this..."
He gestured to a wizard who happened to be in the middle of pushing his spectacles back up his face.
"Is second sorcerer to the Grand Chemist Doomsill."
The wizard half-heartedly waved his left hand while pulling a small vial from his breast pocket and swallowing its contents. Clev seemed bothered by this, but quickly refocused on Rami.
"We are here officially on paper as part of an inspection, but no one with a brain actually believes that because of Abby here."
Clev then gestured to the Blessed. The Blessed seemed to take this as a signal and began to walk over. Instinctively, Rami took a blind step back and seemed to crush Jome's foot with a large portion of his body weight. The man let out a small squawk and jerked his foot away. The Blessed seemed to choose not to notice this and extended a hand to Rami.
"I look forward to working with you in the next few days."
Rami flinched away from her hand, and she smiled in response.
"I have never killed someone loyal to the Empire, Rami, and I do not plan to anytime soon."
Blushing, Rami shook the woman's hands. It seemed normal enough, softer than the soldiers he had taken earlier. He just could not process what was happening. One of the deadliest things in existence was physically touching him. "What did you ask for?" Shira blurted out. Rami turned to hear. Shira seemed to be more excited than anything else. Her eyes darted to Avi's sword, then back up to the woman. A second later, back down to the weapon, then back up to Abby. Clev let out a curt laugh.
"I forgot the effect you have on people, Abby."
He looked over to Jome and Shira, both with a completely neutral expression.
"It's okay," she replied with a smile. "I asked to be very good at what I do. What do you do here? What is your name?"
Shira's face lit up. "I am Shira, and I am a mastersmith, or I'm the mastersmith here." Abby smiled in return.
"Can't be over 30 and already a mastersmith."
She looked over to Clev.
"The mastersmith,"
putting an extra emphasis on master. Clev looked Shira up and down in a calculating manner.
"That plant is beholden to many geniuses, it seems."
He looked back to Jome.
"And who are you, my friend?"
Jome seemed to decide overwhelming confidence was the proper tone to take. "I am a foreman here. Rami's right-hand man is what they say." Rami suppressed a scoff. He had spoken to Jome maybe twice this week. He did not blame the man, though. They seemed to have been socially ambushed here.
"Right,"
Rami said, and looked back to Clev.
"May I take you two to my office so we can discuss what this is about? Shira and Jome here can fill you in on the way on how the plant has been doing. They will verify that everything is running smoothly and our output is at max possible capacity."
A smile pulled on Clev's lips.
"That will not be necessary. We will only need to speak with you, Rami."
He turned to Shira and Jome.
"Would you show Abby here the forge and plant grounds? She insists on being shown every inch of this place before we settle in."
Shira nodded, blurting out, "Of course," and Jome gave an awkward salute. On the way to what Rami suspected would soon no longer be his office, Clev asked surprisingly well-informed questions while the wizard remained silent. Clev's questions touched on the exact mixtures required to make certain types of metals, as well as the process for burning off impurities. The man had clearly done his research. This only made Rami more nervous about his future. The wizard only spoke once the entire walk, asking about the age of the converters. When Rami replied that they all varied in age, the small man had pulled out a book from another jacket pocket and began taking notes. His pace did not slow as he wrote, and the wizard's lack of looking where he was going was a habit that would have to be broken. They entered the small office space, and Clev gestured toward the chair behind the desk. "Please, sit. I do not want you to take any special measures on my behalf." Rami hesitated, but decided not to question something that could be interpreted as an order. He sat on the chair, and Clev walked over to the sink, unbuttoned his sleeves, and began rinsing his hands and face. The wizard stood in the corner and continued his writing. "My lord, I cannot tell you how nice it is to be back among regular people." He looked over to Rami, who was trying to hide surprise at the statement. "I am from near here. Well, not near, but closer than you might believe. You may not believe me, but Abby is the most normal person I have worked with in years." "You're right," Rami replied. "I don't think I can believe you." He then glanced at Doomsill, scribbling in the corner, and decided the statement might actually have some merit to it. Clev let out a chuckle and turned to face him. "I already owe you an apology." He sat in the wooden chair in front of the desk. "We obviously came here under a ruse." "Yes," Rami replied. "Now can you tell me honestly why?" Clev smiled his small smile again. "Why, yes. Yes, I can." "What is it then?" Rami said. He leaned back in his chair, trying to consciously make himself relax his back muscles. "How much steel do you put out a week from one converter?" Clev asked. Rami exhaled. He had begun to suspect something along these lines. "Between 50 to 60 pounds. Terribly inefficient compared to almost any other metal, and a lot of it is brittle." Clev looked over to Doomsill. "And how much will be produced with your new coating?" Doomsill finally looked up from his book. "Depends on how much pig iron you have." Rami looked between them, confused. "We have as much pig iron as you could possibly need. It's the fact that the phosphorus metals make up most of what is slowing." "That is no longer an issue," the wizard cut him off. "Add acid through limestone and the phosphorus will rise to the top." He put his small notebook back into his pocket and looked Romney in the eye. "Skim what rises to the surface off, and you will have the greatest steel ever produced here." Rami took a second to think over what was just said. When he finally spoke, he said, "Is this theoretical, or—" "No, but not done on a mass scale yet. I believe we will now be able to make well over 100 tons of steel per converter in less than a day," the wizard said, again cutting him off. A large grin now split Clev's face. "Congratulations, Rami. You now head the first plant that will be used to flood the world with perfect steel. The plant that will be used to produce the steel to crush the kingdom of Itha in the north. You will retire an Imperial and go down in the history books." Rami realized he was having trouble breathing. He inhaled deeply and said, "Why only here?" Clev sat back in his chair, his grin slightly fading. "The Empire has had its secrets leak before. That will not be allowed to happen again. One plant we can control." A pit formed in Rami's stomach. "My staff?" "Will be kept under watch until the war is won." "And after?" Clev's smile faded entirely. "They will be let to go free, as long as they have been proven loyal to the Empire. This, I swear to you." This did lessen Rami's fear. Imperials always kept their word, and he had provided Rami an out without having to force him to ask the question directly. The Empire had become rapidly more protective of its secrets in recent years. Itha's guns were now rivaling that of Imperial forces, and there was no way that could have been possible without leaks happening over the years. A noise at the window caused Cleve to jerk in his chair and reach for his pistol. Rami looked as well and saw the girl from before staring in at them. How she had gotten into Rami's office became clear. The uneven brick provided perfect handholds for tiny fingers. The girl tried to descend, but the wizard began to glow with a faint light and a harsh twisting of air extended from his now outstretched hand. The girl floated off the wall and hovered in the air for a moment. Humming filled the air as the magic was used, and a sharp, metallic taste filled Rami's mouth. Cleve walked over and opened the window fully. The wizard adjusted his hand, and the girl floated inside. Rami was frozen in place, not from fear, but physically lacked the ability to move. It was only then that he realized the wizard's left hand was pointed at him.
You can never see a wizard use magic on yourself, he thought, only on others.
The wizard lowered his right hand, but kept his left trained on Rami. Cleve took the child's hand and led her to the wooden chair. He made her sit in and began removing the hair from in front of her face.
Unfortunately, my friend, while your men will be under my personal protection, all possible leaks from this location must be stopped at all costs.
The girl, who Rami finally decided could not be older than 8, began to tremble as Cleve continued stroking her curly hair. Cleve looked to Doomsill.
If we are to trust those who we questioned about life at a plant, the lost ones will be nearly impossible to keep out.
An imperial accent that had previously been hidden filled his voice.